Well, welcome everybody to the English Catholic History Association talk this evening. I'm not sure how many more people are joining. We will start soon. So very welcome to everybody anyway. And for those who don't know, this is I don't know whether you can see this at all, the newsletter. But anyway, that's available to members, and it's well worth joining if you haven't joined the association already. This evening we've got a fantastic speaker, Elizabeth Norton, who's going to be talking on the Blounts of the West Midlands shortly. So say very welcome to everybody. I think we're pretty much ready then. So I'll do a quick biography of Elizabeth Norton. So Elizabeth has degrees from Cambridge, Oxford, and a PhD from London University, and she's written books such as The Lives of Tudor Women, and she's been on TV. She's a consultant for programs, and she's currently writing a biography of Jane Seymour. So a very busy lady, and so we're very lucky to have such a distinguished speaker this evening. So very welcome, Dr. Norton.
Well, thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So I will be talking to you today about the Blounts of the West Midlands, and I should just say it's sort of people argue very passionately for pronunciation. It's either Blount or Blunt, depending on which branch of the family you are. Even in the 16th century, we can tell that there are different pronunciations. Some very much spell their name Blunt, and others Blount with a W. So I'm going to use Blount, but I'm obviously aware that for some people the pronunciation will seem wrong and it should be Blunt. So I hope you will forgive me. So I'm going to talk for the next sort of 45 minutes to an hour or so on the Blounts of the West Midlands. Traditionally, historical study of religion in the post-Reformation period has been characterized as a distinction between Protestant and Catholic, with the individuals placed neatly into one or other of these categories. The starting point for any attempt to define just what a Catholic was, of course, must be John Bossy, whose work in relation to the English Catholics in the 1970s was groundbreaking. For Bossy, the English Catholic Church was, and this is a quote, a body which had some right to claim continuity with the past, but was nevertheless in most respects a new creation. J.C.H. Aveling, in his 1976 study of recusancy in England, for example, considered that Catholicism in England was virtually dead by the 1570s, with the Jesuit missionaries who arrived in the 1580s finding only, and this is a quote from him, schismatics, conformists with a bias towards Catholicism. A similarly hard-line position was espoused in the 1980s by Peter Holmes in his study of the political thought of Elizabethan Catholics, with the view that all Catholics were of the opinion that God's laws should be obeyed above that of the sovereign. For Holmes, as it was for Aveling, a true Catholic was one who refused to attend Anglican church services since, and this is a quote, soon the activity recusancy signified Catholicism itself. And of course, the prevailing course of scholarship over the last 20 years or so has very much rejected these neat conclusions, with the beliefs of Catholics in particular coming under considerable scrutiny. It's no longer possible to maintain a rigidity of definition for those who can be considered Catholics. And instead, it must be seen that Catholicism, like Protestantism, admitted those with a range of beliefs and practices to some extent. The work of Michael Kestier in particular has demonstrated that artificial divisions between different types of Catholics were actually porous, and with the views and responses to pressures of individual Catholics changing over time. And I think a recognition of this is the key to understanding just what made a Catholic and how they portrayed themselves or were portrayed in Elizabethan England. We can see this too in the work of Alexandra Walsham, particularly in relation to church papists, who, with many people changing from recusancy to church papistry at various points in their life, it's actually quite unusual to find someone that is solely a recusant or solely a church papist in the period. In general, people tend to move between the positions. Walsham identifies that families sometimes pursue strategies with, for example, the women of the family remaining recusants and refusing to come to church, while the male head of the family attended the Protestant parish church in order to safeguard the family's wealth and status. it is very clear, and has been for some years, that a wide variety of strategies were pursued by English Catholics. And this isn't surprising, of course, because Catholic worship became illegal in England with Elizabeth's settlement of 1559. And there are increasingly harsh penalties levied against those who refuse to attend the mandatory Church of England services. So it becomes very difficult, of course, to worship as a Catholic in Elizabethan England. So I've got two very complex family trees on both sides of the slide, so I don't expect you to take it all in. It's really just give you a sense of just how big the family we're talking about is. Given the wide range of strategies employed, it's interesting, I think, to look at specific families to see how Catholic families maintain their faith during this difficult period. And as such, the Blount family of the West Midlands, who were the subject of my PhD thesis, do, I think, make an interesting case study. In the thesis, I looked at various aspects of the family's political, economic and social life, from how they administered their manors to their roles as leaders of their counties, their contact with the royal court and their military service, amongst other topics. But by far the most significant aspect of the thesis was to look at how the family responded to the changes of the Reformation. So today I want to introduce the Blounts and explain why they are important before looking in detail about what we know about their faith during the early Reformation period, and then particularly how they continue to worship and promulgate their faith into the later 16th century. Because I think they provide a useful case study of Elizabethan English Catholics, which adds to existing scholarship on the subject. So here's just the second half of that family tree. And again, it shows just how many names there are on it, why they're such a large family. And one of the reasons, of course, I picked the Blounts as a case study was because they are such a broad and large family. So the Blounts were, with the exception of the Mountjoy branch, which was ennobled in 1465, they were a gentry family, and they have seats throughout the West Midlands, including in Herefordshire, Staffordshire, Shropshire, Worcestershire and Oxfordshire. They're a large and often quite distantly related family. To some of the branches, the last common ancestor goes back to the end of the 14th century. But they have been described as still well knit in the 16th century. And I think this does hold true. There are many examples of the family acknowledging relatedness and acting together as a kinship group in the period. Apart from the Mountjoy branch, the most prominent Tudor branch of the family was that of Kinlet in Shropshire. And this produced Elizabeth Blount, or more famously Bessie Blount, who was the mother of Henry VIII's only acknowledged illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond. All branches of the family had considerable local importance. They served as county sheriffs, members of parliament, and also on commissions of the peace, for example. What's quite interesting about the family is that once we get through the sort of early Reformation period, almost all members of the wider family do appear to have been Catholic, so they provide an excellent study for Catholic identity in the Elizabethan period. And here we just have a map showing where some of their principal residences or manors are, sort of showing that we do have quite a cluster, particularly on the Shropshire-Worcestershire borders. The church was, of course, central to the lives of almost everyone in the 16th century. And, you know, the concept of atheism was seen as largely ridiculous in a world that looked miraculous. So everybody, of course, believes in God in the 16th century. The evidence of the Blounts in the immediate pre-Reformation period and during the early Reformation period supports this picture. And the evidence is patchy, but it's quite interesting. So I'll take you through some of that now before we move on to the Elizabethan period. So here, of course, we have Kinlet Church, the parish church, which still stands and once stood right next to Kinlet Hall, although the current hall on the site is 18th century. We can certainly see the centrality of the parish church in the life of Sir Humphrey Blount of Kinlet, who was born in 1422 and died in 1477. He and his wife were buried in Kinlet Church. They were buried in the picture on the slide. And actually Humphrey requested this in his will of 1477. We also actually have considerable surviving details of his baptism, which took place on the day of his birth on the 25th of November, 1422, again in Kinlet Parish Church. He had 3 godparents. One was a neighbouring gentleman, one was the parson of Broughton, and the other was the Countess of Warwick, all of whom actually attended the baptism in person and drank in the church, as the source, which is actually a writ, confirms. Servants of the family attended, with one recalling in 1444 that he had been bitten during the ceremony by the Countess's greyhound, so it was obviously quite memorable for him. 2 wax torches were burnt near the font, while another family servant brought bread and 2 silver pots full of sweet wine into the church for the ceremony. Another servant filled the font with water, and a further servant went to a house next to the church to use their fire to light torches. At the same time as the baptism, a female servant of a neighbour, Clement Draper, was married in the church. And the source also refers to preparations made for the churching of Humphrey's mother, Alice, with red wine purchased for the occasion. The document goes into considerable detail, and it gives a real impression of a community centred on the parish church and church ceremony. With all levels of society in Kinlet attending the baptism, it's a point where they're able to mingle together. Surviving household accounts for Humphrey's godmother, Elizabeth Berkeley, Countess of Warwick, also provide evidence of communal religious life. The Countess regularly received visits from ecclesiastics, such as the canon of Hereford Cathedral and friars from Bristol, Worcester and Droitwich. It was actually her habit to invite the local parish priest and often also the parish clerk to dine with her on a Sunday wherever she was staying. So here we have the tomb of Humphrey Blount and his wife, Elizabeth Winnington. And again, this is in the inside Kinlet Parish Church. The fabric of parish churches can also indicate a thriving belief system. Lavish spending on tombs has been identified as a marker of the strength of traditional faith due to connections of such monuments as intercessory objects, of course, to the doctrine of purgatory. Kinlet Church includes tombs. It also has a side chapel in stained glass, all dating to the late medieval period. The tomb of Sir Humphrey Blount and his wife was probably commissioned by their son Thomas in the early 16th century. It's an alabaster altar tomb, as you can see, with recumbent effigies of the couple. Their children are displayed as weepers around the base of the tomb chest, actually alongside a depiction of the Virgin Mary and an angel. And again, these images highlight the fact that the tomb was produced in the pre-Reformation era, and also highlight the fact that, to a large extent, this church wasn't particularly altered by the Reformation, and because it remains quite a traditional area. We have a close-up of the angel. Obviously, the face has been damaged. Arguments that the late medieval church was in decline are often based on ideas that the clergy were considered inadequate, although there is no evidence for this from late 15th century Kinlet. From at least the early 14th century, the benefice at Kinlet was in the grant of the monastery at Wigmore. Where they failed to supply a vicar, the bishop had authority to make an appointment. And actually, this power was exercised more than once in relation to Kinlet in the medieval period. Church patronage was both a spiritual right and an important property right of the patron in the early modern period, making the relationship between patron, parish and appointee quite a complex one. Wigmore Abbey, however, was a major religious house in the local area, and one which had strong links to Kinlet, also to the neighbouring parish of Highley, which is in the village of Kinlet, and in which the Blounts leased land, and also the Blount family manor of Mamble in Worcestershire, which is only 6 miles from Kinlet and belongs to another branch of the Blount family. Before the Reformation, Wigmore Abbey paid a pension of 20 shillings a year to the vicar of Highley, a considerable sum and one which helped maintain links between the parish and the abbey. The church at Mamble was also in the grant of Wigmore Abbey, and again, there's strong links maintained between the two parishes. Thomas Rushbury, for example, was presented as vicar of Mamble by Wigmore Priory on the 6th of February 1525, and he remained in office until the 20th of February 1532, when he was moved to Highley, so he was promoted to the richer parish at Highley. On the same day, the abbey appointed Edward Rushbury to his kinsman's former living at Mamble. And there's nothing to suggest any decline in the abbey's authority in the parishes in this pre-Reformation period. Both Rushburys were still in their respective churches in 1535, and it appears that life was very much business as usual at Highbury and Mamble on the eve of the Reformation, and also, of course, at the point of the dissolution of the monasteries. The evidence from Kinlet, although fairly sparse, would seem to support the picture of a late medieval church in no way in terminal decline. If anything, it appears as a vibrant part of the community. And here we have the ruins of Much Wenlock Abbey. which is also very close to Kinlet and very much in sort of what I call Blount country, the West Midlands. We can get a glimpse of the family's faith during the early Reformation period, during the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI. Agnes Blount of Kinlet, who was the fifth daughter of Sir John and Catherine Blount, married Richard Lacon of Wiley in around 1520. Wiley had a chapel, but it was dependent on Holy Trinity Church in Much Wenlock, so it didn't have the status of a full parish church. Anne and Richard Lacon therefore had strong links to the church at Much Wenlock, which can be seen in the register of its vicar, Sir Thomas Botella or Sir Thomas Butler, depending on how you pronounce it. Although the register begins in 1538, there are numerous references to earlier religious practices. Like Kinlet, Highley and Mamble, Much Wenlock was dominated by a religious house, with the prior of Wenlock Priory appointing Botella to his living. And the monks also assisted in services in the parish churches. So again, they're very much linked to monasticism. Throughout the period between 1538 and 1562, Botella made references to various priests, monks and servants of the priory, including a porter, carpenter, sexton, cellarer, brewers and an organ player. The priory was of considerable importance to town, with many of the people listed in Botella's register having direct or indirect contact with the monastery. They continued to be largely defined by this association in relation to their religious activities after the dissolution, showing that the monastery remained a popular and important part of daily life in the area. Just another image from Wenlock Priory. Agnes Blount and her husbands, Richard Lacon and Thomas Ridley, were involved in the church community at Much Wenlock. In 1541, for example, the youngest child of Agnes's first marriage, Edward Lacon, was baptised in the church. On the 16th of January 1542, her first husband, Richard Lacon, was buried at Harley after, and this is a quote, "licence being obtained of me, Sir Thomas Butler, at the request of divers gentlemen of the neighbourhood." One of the couple's servants was buried in the church in 1545. And Agnes also played an important role in the visit of Nicholas Heath, Bishop of Worcester, in July 1554. The bishop was invited to take refreshments in the town and was taken to the house of a local gentleman, which was, and this is a quote, "hanged and decked after the best manner the said burgess could." And actually the silver plate from which the bishop drank was borrowed from Agnes, suggesting that she approved of the visit. Later that year in November, Agnes's infant son from her second marriage, George Ridley, was buried by Botella at Wiley. Agnes had a personal association with Botella since they both stood as godparents to Agnes Charlton when she was buried at Wiley on the 12th of March 1540. When she was baptised even. It's very obvious from his register that Sir Thomas Botella did not embrace the religious reform of Henry VIII and Edward VI's reigns. He lamented the destruction of St Milburga's tomb and the burning of images in the town in November 1547, for example. And I mean, he's very clearly joyful when Mary I comes to the throne, declaring that when the proclamation was made in the town, and this is a quote, "people made great joy, casting up their caps and hats, lauding, thanking and praising God Almighty with ringing of bells and making of bonfires in every street." And he records the renewed use of Latin in services and the fact that Mass was celebrated in the church again following Mary's accession. On the 25th of June 1559, however, he recorded that "here is to be had in remembrance that the celebration of the divine service in the English tongue was begun this day." Clearly, Botella obeyed the law, but he did so with no great enthusiasm, setting the likely tone for worship in the parish. Here we just have another close-up of images from Wenlock Priory. Agnes's mother, Catherine Blount, was responsible for the appointment of a former monk, Alan Cliff, to the vicarage at Kinlet in 1539, a man actually that she would later make executor of her will, so it suggests that they have a somewhat close relationship. Cliff continued his position as vicar of Kinlet throughout the entirety of Edward VI's reign. And this does raise the question, I think, I would argue, that of just how far the Protestant Reformation had permeated into the popular religion of the parish, in spite of the legal changes wrought. I mean, I always think it's quite telling that in Sir Thomas Botella's account, they were able to ring bells to celebrate Mary's accession, because of course the bells were supposed to have been removed. It has been noted that many parishes were not served by a committed Protestant minister until late in the reign of Elizabeth I. And Cliff, of course, would have been ordained as a Catholic minister, as a Catholic priest. In an inventory of Kinlet Parish Church carried out on the 17th of May 1553, it was recorded that the church had retained 4 bells, 1 saint bell and 1 chalice of silver, something that again indicates that the religious changes of Edward VI's reign were not embraced in the parish. And here we have the tomb of Sir John Blount and his wife Catherine. The surviving, again in Kinlet Church, the monuments in Kinlet Church are really excellent if you're thinking of paying a visit. The surviving pre-Reformation religious evidence relating to the Blounts demonstrates genuine belief, but no exceptional level of piety. I mean, there's nothing that the Blounts are doing in this period that would sort of mark them out as exceptionally pious. And again, this is something we would expect amongst the population as a whole. As Eamon Duffy has identified, the late medieval church was a part of daily life, with religious devotion rarely displayed in an exceptional and thus likely to survive in the sources way by individuals. John and Catherine Blount of Kinlet, these are the parents of Bessie Blount, I should say, they showed just such a level of piety when in around 1517, they paid for their names and the names of the 9 children that they had produced, including those that were already deceased, to be added to a bead roll produced for the Archdeaconry of Stafford while they were living at Knightley in Staffordshire. However, while this shows evidence of a belief in purgatory, of course, and other tenets of traditional belief, which would be expected at the time, there was nothing exceptional in this. 45,000 of their neighbours also appear on this bead roll. Also, although names continued to be added until at least 1532 or 1533, John and Catherine did not offer a further donation to add the names of their 2 youngest children after their births. So they, like most of their peers, lived in a society that could not conceive of life without the church or religion. It was part of daily life, and there's really no signs that it's in decline, at least in relation to the Blounts in this period. So this brings us on to the Elizabethan period, where I want to spend the remainder and sort of the bulk of this lecture. While on a theological level, it was understood by most people with Catholic beliefs that they should not attend Protestant church services, particularly, in fact, after 1566, when the decisions of the Council of Trent began to be known. Their lived experience of being Catholics under a Protestant government could be very different. So as you know, they are aware that they are not supposed to attend heretical church services, but it's quite, I think, difficult at a grassroots level in the late 16th century necessarily to comply with all the tenets of the church. So George Blount of Kinlet, who's shown on his very grand double-decker tomb that was paid for by his nephew on the slide, he was the most socially prominent Elizabethan member of the family, apart again from Lord Mountjoy, and he died in 1581. He was included in a 1577 list of, and this is a quote, all persons of the Diocese of Hereford as refused to come to church. And this was actually produced in order to value lands as a first step towards confiscation, indicating that he was not then attending church. His lands weren't confiscated, so he either did begin to attend church or the government didn't follow through with the threat at this stage. It's not clear what, and of course he dies 4 years later. Kinlet Manor contained a private Catholic chapel under George's successors, the Lakens, and it may be that this was already in use during George's period of occupation. Here we just have a close-up of George. George's beliefs had come under suspicion before 1577. In a 1564 list of officials in his diocese, the Bishop of Hereford, perhaps tactfully, described George, who was actually then serving as Sheriff of Shropshire, as one of the men which be counted neuters in religion. And so someone not considered to be favourable to the Protestant religious settlement. The Bishop of Lichfield at the same time considered George, who was then a Justice of the Peace for Staffordshire, to be one of those accounted of good men adversaries to religion, and no favourers therefore, thereof, neither in deed nor word. So the characterizations here are of George as both a church papist and a recusant, depending on circumstances. And this really fits with the known circumstances of his life. Even when he was refusing to attend Protestant services, he was compliant to some extent. For example, in 1575, the Bishop and Dean of Worcester mediated in a matrimonial dispute between George and his wife. They eventually actually separate. And he produces a separation agreement. George's will which he made before his death in 1581, contains a highly ambiguous statement of faith, which could be acceptable to Catholics and Protestants in the period, as do most family wills in the Elizabethan period. And of course, we can't always rely on statements of faith in wills. There's often no evidence that they were dictated by the testator. But some of the Blount ones do look quite bespoke, which suggests that they may have played a part in drafting them. George's cousin, the frequent recusant Thomas Blount of Astley, who died in 1622, actually went much further in his will. He may only have declared in his will's preamble that I commend my soul into the hands of my maker, by whose death and passion I hope to be saved. But he also left £30 to, and this is a quote, poor distressed Catholics, which is about as unambiguous a statement of his religious faith and sympathies as you can get. Such an explicit reference to a testator's Catholicism is highly unusual, but it does demonstrate the surprisingly open way in which some individuals were prepared to present their faith. And Thomas Blount of Astley, whose will was a deathbed one, was perhaps emboldened by his approaching death. Here we have Thomas Blount's parents, Robert and Anne Blount of Astley. Astley is in Worcestershire, quite a small settlement. The Blounts of Astley, they're quite closely related to the Blounts of Kinlet, in fact, and they're George Blount's first cousins. The Blounts of Astley demonstrate the ability to alternate between recusancy and church papistry, again, supporting the prevailing historiographical position. As early as 1564, Robert Blount of Astley was referred to as one of the adversaries of true religion by the Bishop of Worcester. His daughter Elizabeth was actually convicted of recusancy on the 28th of March 1588, and she'd been a recusant since the 20th of September 1586, so a year and a half. She was convicted again on the 26th of July 1588 before evidently conforming and coming to the parish church. Her sister-in-law, Frances Blount, was convicted of 12 months recusancy on the 28th of March 1588, and also again of recusancy on the 15th of July 1588. Frances's husband, Thomas, continued to attend church for some time, and actually his first conviction for recusancy isn't until the 26th of February 1590 for 7 months of recusancy. So he isn't necessarily in line with the women of his family, and this suggests the pattern of behaviour identified by Alexandra Walsham, whereby the male head of the family attended Anglican services in order to protect the family's resources and reputation, and thereby enabling his wife's recusancy and her safeguarding of the spiritual integrity of the household. Thomas Blount and his second wife, Bridget, later both become recusants. So here we have the church in Astley. Although a gentleman of some means, Thomas Blount of Astley professed himself unable to pay his fines, with his property seized in October 1590. Actually, looking at the figures for his property, they clearly were quite undervalued when calculating the fine. Percentage of his property is seized for his recusancy. His estates are worth considerably less than had been returned at his father's death, for example, which either suggests some complicity, someone trying not to cost him too much money in the fines, or perhaps that he's able to dissipate the property to some extent. In 1593, Thomas submitted, attending Bishop Fletcher at Worcester Cathedral, and he'd actually earlier in the day attended divine service with the bishop at Astley Parish Church. The bishop also certified that witnesses had seen Thomas attend Astley Parish Church every Sunday and Holy Day for the past 2 months, with Blount promising that he would continue to obey the law. As a gesture of his good faith, he had his son, another Thomas, baptised in Astley Parish Church that same year, and that's actually the only one of his children baptised there. Baptism is a somewhat easy where you can quite easily avoid the parish church, because of course children have to be baptized. So a lot of Catholic parents seem to have said that their children were too ill at birth, and so they were baptized immediately before coming to the parish church. So it's quite common for Catholic families, and we can see this with the Blounts, for their children not to be baptized in the parish church. Presumably they've been baptized at home. So he does allow his son Thomas to be baptized in the parish church. Given that Jesuits such as Henry Garnet preached it was not lawful for a child to be baptized by a Protestant priest, this was potentially a substantial concession on Thomas Blount's part, although there were doctrinal variations on this point, since any baptism was in theory valid. The bishop's involvement, as well as the emphasis in the submission that Thomas had, and this is a quote, willingly submitted himself in his due obedience to the Queen's most excellent majesty, suggests that political pressure was placed upon him to conform due to his local status. He's the first known and highest ranking Worcestershire recusant to submit in Elizabeth's reign. Thomas Blount of Astley's willingness to conform was enough for his Catholicism to be largely ignored by the government for a time. He was evidently torn between his religious faith and his desire to appear loyal to the crown. And he's again convicted of recusancy 3 years later, with 2/3 of his property then confiscated. Although, as I've said, this is quite a lot of much significantly lower value than his father had possessed at his death, which does suggest that he has been able to siphon off some of his assets. He did not submit again until 1606, with the period of 10 years in which he was once again a recusant, leading to him coming under increasing government surveillance. The pattern that he followed of recusancy and then church papistry was one that can be paralleled with other contemporary Catholics. When accused of recusancy, Lord Vaux very famously attempted to claim that his household was a parish in itself, thus enabling him to attend services in his own chapel. The Blounts of Soddington, who are cousins of the Kinlet and the Astley Blounts, and live primarily at Mamble, which is in Worcestershire, which is close to Kinlet, they arguably made similar attempts to control the worship in their own parish church. It's clear that this branch of the family were Catholic. I mean, there's very clear evidence. Family members such as Thomas Blount of Soddington's daughter, Dorothy Heath of Alvechurch, remained regular recusants when no longer residing at Mamble. No members of the family actually resident at Mamble, or in fact anyone else resident at Mamble, was convicted of recusancy in the period. While the church wardens may not have been fulfilling their reporting obligations, and this does happen quite commonly where the Lord is of course a Catholic and it's the church wardens tend to be their tenants, it is potentially due to the Blounts' ability to control the worship in their local parish church. Lists of vicars of Mamble are very patchy, but Humphrey Longley was appointed in 1579 by Sir Leonard Maisie, who was the son of Anne Blount of Kinlet and was married to a sister of the Catholic lawyer Edmund Plowden. So these connections would suggest that he was a Catholic. Unfortunately, no details of Humphrey Longley survive, but the circumstances of his appointment do not preclude him from being a man of traditional beliefs. And in any event, much of the parish clergy early in Elizabeth's reign had previously been Catholic and thus validly ordained in the eyes of their Catholic parishioners. That the Soddington Blounts were attending parish worship may account for the fact that family members' religion was considered somewhat ambiguous. Bishop Sandys reported in 1564 that one family member, Walter Blount of Sillington, for example, was indifferent in religion or else of no religion. Greater evidence of the continuing importance of the parish church to the Blounts of Soddington can be seen in the construction of the Blount Chapel, which we can see here on the slide. And this dates to approximately 1560. The chapel is now a ruin, having been allowed to fall into disrepair in the 20th century. And this was due to the fact that it was by then a Catholic chapel attached to a Protestant parish church, and the Blount family had been responsible for the upkeep. So when the Blount family died out in the local area in the 20th century, it was simply abandoned by the diocese. When the chapel was officially recognised as Catholic is unclear, although it clearly wasn't before 1868, when the antiquary John Noakes, who recorded that there are a few Roman Catholics at Mamble, briefly described the church and chapel, and he doesn't describe it as a Catholic chapel. While usually described as a family or mortuary chapel, there is actually nothing in the fabric or monumental scheme of the building to distinguish it from the chantry chapels of the early Tudor period and medieval periods. And of course, their primary function was to assist the progress of the donor's soul through purgatory. Chantries, of course, didn't necessarily need to be a physical space at all, but they were outlawed in 1547 in any event and achieved only a limited revival under Mary I. Donors were probably wary of confiscation by the Crown. Families who owned or acquired a physical chantry chapel usually continued to use it for burial. As Catholics, it is highly probable that the Blounts of Mamble considered intercessory prayers desirable, something which most likely influenced the desire to construct the chapel. Although rare, there are, just on the slide here, we have Sir Thomas Blount, actually in the Blount Chapel at Mamble, had a cadaver tomb, a transy tomb, displaying him as a skeleton. I've actually argued in a previous article on the Blount transy tombs that they potentially are a continuing attempt to obtain intercessory prayers with their memento mori function. The skeleton itself no longer sits in the chapel because the chapel no longer has a roof, so they've moved it inside the church. So although rare, there are other examples of existing chapels that continue to function as chantries, or, as in the case at Mamble, of new chapels erected for the purpose. The Blounts of Mapledurham in Oxfordshire made use of a medieval chantry chapel called the Bardolph Aisle in their local parish church. And they acquired this in the first half of the 16th century. Here we have the Bardolph Aisle. And they continued to use it for burial and presumably worship in the Elizabethan period. It was in this period, actually, that the family added a door connecting the chapel to the main body of the church. The chapel remains, or the aisle remains, in the family's ownership today and functions as a Catholic chapel in a Protestant parish church. So very similar to how the Mamble Chapel once would have done. The Catholic Fitzalan Chapel at Arundel in West Sussex is another example of a medieval chantry chapel, which has continued to fulfill a similar function. And again, is a Catholic chapel attached to a Protestant parish church. So these do exist. It was used as a burial place of the Catholic Fitzalan family in the 16th century, including the 19th Earl in 1580. Memorial masses continue to be held there for the souls of those buried in the chapel. Of even greater interest is the chapel at Beaulieu in Worcestershire, which is actually only a few miles from Mamble. This chapel was constructed towards the end of the 16th century by the Catholic Sheldon family and has been described as a clandestine chantry chapel. The comparison is an apt one, I think, since, as with Mamble, there is nothing to distinguish it from earlier examples other than the fact that it was constructed in a period in which purgatory was outlawed. The meaning of these spaces was ambiguous enough that they could exist both as a simple memorial to deceased family and as a chantry in which intercessory prayers could be offered to the dead. The existence of the Mamble Chapel and the Bardolph Aisle at Mapledurham also meant that the family could sit in private during Protestant services. They have a space that's not necessarily in the main body of the church. So without participating, but still obeying the letter of the law. And we see this example of church papers across the country. There are accounts of church papers pacing up and down during the Protestant service, or having their hands over their ears, or praying loudly on their rosary. So they're present and obeying the law, but they're not actually participating in the service. So in relation to the Blounts, this coupled with the potential of a local landowner to influence the worship in their parish church, I think it does demonstrate ways in which ambiguity could be used to both promote Catholic identity and also facilitate worship in the period. The fact that these chapels existed as part of the parish church also strongly suggests a desire to assert an ownership of the parish church, in spite of the fact that it had been adopted for Protestant worship. So moving on, Kinlet Hall also housed a Catholic chapel during the Lacon's family ownership. So after George Blount dies in 1581, his nephew Roland Lacon inherits Kinlet Hall. In 1605, Sir Francis Lacon and his daughter hosted a visit by the Jesuits Henry Garnet, John Gerard and John Percy, and they were accompanied by several Catholic notables such as Anne Vaux and Ambrose Rookwood. The party were on a pilgrimage to St Winifred's Well, and they heard Mass at Kinlet. Since Kinlet Hall had no specific chapel, this would have been a room converted in the house. But of course, chapels need not be Spartan. When a distant cousin, Father Richard Blount, who would later head the Jesuits in England, celebrated Mass at Scotney Castle in Sussex, for example, which we can see on the slide here, he used a wide range of portable equipment, such as church stuff and books, which were hidden with him in a priest's hole when the household was searched. Kinlet, at the time of the Lacons, contained lodgings for priests, with presumably hiding places to allow them to escape detection. Unfortunately, of course, the Tudor Kinlet Hall doesn't survive, so we can't look for priest hides. It is possible that the priests at Kinlet were able to pass as upper servants and thus have their own rooms in the hall. We know from government reports that priests were frequently in residence there. Here we have Kinlet Church again. In addition to their private chapel, the Lacons were believed to be running a secret Catholic printing press at Kinlet in the early years of the 17th century. The government informer William Udall, who was acquainted with several branches of the family, considered that the satirical work Puritanus was first printed there. The two known editions of this work, which dates of 1609 and 1610, were printed at Saint-Omer and smuggled into England by a Joan and John Dowbrig's court, who were imprisoned for the offence. However, this doesn't preclude an earlier Kinlet edition. Similarly, William Udall considered the former Jesuit Thomas Wright to be the author, a priest associated with the Lacons, who again, the successors to the Blounts at Kinlet. His other known works, which included a treatise showing the possibility and conveniency of the real presence of our Saviour in the Blessed Sacrament from 1596, mostly claimed to be printed at Antwerp, although in fact it was secretly printed in England. Puritanus was considered to be particularly offensive to the authorities. It was noted in 1609 by one Catholic, now they make their colour as if they had commissioned to search for two very odious books to the state and extreme dangerous to Catholics. So one of these books was actually Puritanus, which attacked Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and James I. When it first appeared, searches were carried out at the Venetian ambassador's house, with 700 copies burned in St. Paul's churchyard. It's not at all unlikely that Kinlet was used for the production of Catholic works, although it cannot be proved. Lawrence Warren, who is believed to have been in charge of the Kinlet press, ran a secret press in the late 1590s at the house of another gentleman in Warwickshire, and it would have been possible for a similar setup to be adopted at Kinlet. The evidence of the priests, the 1605 pilgrimage to St. Winifred's Well, and the printing press all show that Kinlet was part of a larger network of Catholic contacts. So the Blount family supports the view that it was possible to be a Catholic in England in the 16th century, but to practice in a very different way to others of the same faith. So they're adopting their own strategies for worship. Arguably, Catholic gentlemen drew other Catholics into their service, as well as helping to ensure that lower ranking members of society were able to continue to practice their faith. There was certainly an enduring Catholic presence at Blount family manors in Staffordshire, with a 1657 survey of recusants showing that they were home to a high proportion of Catholics, often in fairly lowly position actually, such as husbandmen, glovers and labourers. In around 1586, a report on the Englefield family, who lived near Reading, recorded that the household included one James Linger, who, and this is a quote, under colour of teaching on the virginals, goeth from papist to papist, is thought also to be a priest, so made in Queen Mary's time. And the movement of this priest ensured that the household was far from isolated, as did the fact that Catholic families often intermarried. Henry Englefield took Elizabeth Blount of Soddington as his second wife, for example, ensuring that the Soddington Blounts were in contact with other Catholic gentry, often actually some distance from Shropshire and Worcestershire. Catholic Blounts also played prominent parts in local and national level public life, which I'll move on to now. So here we have the tomb of Sir George Blount, again with his estranged wife, Constance. Catholic loyalism was conditional and complex in the Elizabethan period, with it recognised by historians that both recusants and church papists were able to retain office and influence in society. Such tacit acceptance should not, however, be seen as a form of toleration, and because, of course, we all know this concept was very different in the early modern period, given the moral duty of individuals to correct religious deviance. As the example of the Blount shows, it was possible, however, for something approaching the modern definition of toleration to be shown to individuals who are at least tacitly, and often quite openly, known to be Catholics, without condoning their religion. As such, individuals occupied a liminal and insecure place in society, yet it's evident that they could also attain high office and a position of authority. And so I think it's quite necessary to distinguish between hostility to individuals and hostility to their ideologies. So here we have Sir George Blount of Kinlet again, who we of course already met and whose Catholic faith was widely known. He continued to enjoy a career in public service up until his death. For example, in October 1570, he was appointed by the Privy Council to act in relation to a local Staffordshire dispute over ownership of a bridge. In February 1575, he was again employed by the Privy Council to arbitrate in a local dispute. So he remains an important local government figure. Here we have another of the Blount family tombs from Astley. I don't have a picture of Thomas Blount, unfortunately. A more dramatic example can be seen in the case of Thomas Blount of Astley, whom again we've already discussed. In October 1598, a number of Worcestershire recusants, including Thomas, were summoned to appear before the Privy Council for unspecified offences. While there, it appears that Thomas agreed to spy on the Earl of Essex, who was the stepson of his cousin Christopher Blount of Kidderminster, by joining Essex's army in Ireland. According to the report of the government agent, again it's William Udall, in October 1599, he was able to learn what had passed between Essex and the Earl of Tyrone in a treasonable interview in Ireland. Thomas Blount and 2 other gentlemen hid close by in a hollow place to hear what was said. Thomas's testimony was actually useful enough for Robert Cecil to write to the Bishop of Worcester to inform him that when Thomas returned home, he should be dealt with, and this is a quote from Cecil, with secrecy and security. Otherwise, being a recusant, he may be fearful and keep out of the way. He is of an honest and loyal disposition as any of his sort may be. Udall too considered him to be a gentleman of good worth in a letter to the Queen in 1599, in which he referred to Thomas's Catholicism. So he is well known to be a Catholic. Thomas's recusancy left him open to government suspicion, but by proving his loyalty, he did not suffer harm. Something which again supports the view that public offices were not necessarily closed to Catholics during the last years of Elizabeth's reign. In a personal interview with Cecil in 1601, Thomas Blount of Astley assured the minister, as Cecil recorded, that he can reveal, and this is a quote, he can reveal all of Sir Christopher Blount's practices, which in private to me he utterly condemned. Thomas was actually not the only member of the family prepared to inform against Christopher, with Cecil's papers from 1601 recording that he was known to have been reconciled to the Catholic Church while in Dublin, and that these parties in England can witness it. It's a quote again. Sir Edward Blount of Kidderminster, Sir Francis Lakin of Shropshire, and Mr. Thomas Blount of Astley. Sir Edward was Christopher's brother, while Francis and Thomas were cousins. All 3 were Catholics, yet they were prepared to inform the government of Christopher's Catholicism. Lakin and Thomas Blount of Astley also served with him in Ireland, so they have quite a close contact with him. So it's somewhat surprising we don't have a portrait of Sir Christopher Blount, because he's actually probably the most significant member of the family at the end of the 16th century. It's the best I can do, which are images of him, of Christopher and his brother as weepers on their parents' tomb. Obviously, it's not intended to be a likeness. So who was Christopher Blount? Because he is such an important member of the family. He was the younger son of Thomas Blount of Kidderminster and was born in approximately 1556. So he's a first cousin of the Kinlet Blounts. He was tutored by William Allen at Louvain in 1561 and until 1562, and he returned home when Allen returned to England. He matriculated along with his elder brother Edward at Hart Hall in Oxford in 1572, but he didn't take a degree. He instead matriculated at the English College at Dewey to train for the priesthood in 1575. So again, he's quite openly Catholic. He abandoned this training the following year and went to Paris. By the 30th of October 1577, Christopher had come to the attention of Sir Amias Paulet there, who, recognising Christopher's Catholicism, advised him in an interview to eschew the company of dissident papists, which actually Christopher agreed to do. Paulet was a Puritan and very anti-Catholic, but actually made no attempt to persuade Christopher to abandon his Catholicism. He just merely warned him to be careful. But he did write to inform Sir Francis Walsingham in England that Christopher and a gentleman named Watkins from Dorset were both, and this is a quote, both making open profession of popery, and had left Paris for England a week before in the company of a servant of Thomas Morgan's, who was Mary Queen of Scots' French agent. Christopher's Catholic background was widely known. According to a letter to Mary Queen of Scots from Thomas Morgan in July 1585, Christopher had recently been to Tutbury, where Mary was imprisoned, to survey the state of the country there and the people, as well as, and this is a quote, to frame intelligence with your majesty. Morgan, after speaking with Christopher's cousin Robert Poley, considered that Christopher hath been well brought up by his careful and devout parents, which be good Catholics. And he actually attributed the family's ability to retain their Catholic beliefs to the fact that his father had been a kinsman of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and that he had been honoured by him. And this is a sort of slightly longer quote. Yet because Leicester is a great tyrant in the realm, where Catholics be so plagued, this Blount and his elder brother both being Catholics, and their mother a notable honest gentlewoman, they are all forced to their great charges to fawn upon Leicester, to see if thereby they may live quiet, and not be continually troubled for their faith and consciences. And by Leicester's means they have been more quietly handled than some others. And this is the reason they have in this time followed Leicester, which God knoweth have been chargeable to them. For Leicester is not born to do good to God's people. And so I think this is a really interesting quote, because Morgan's concept of how to live quiet, as he calls it, is bound up in the patronage networks. He considers that the Blounts of Kidderminster have been largely untouched by persecution due to Leicester's protection. And of course, Leicester himself is of a Puritan leaning, so it's quite a surprising association. Thomas Morgan, who had been in contact with Christopher since the latter's time in Paris, was convinced that Christopher was loyal to the Queen of Scots. But actually there is strong evidence that in relation to Mary, Christopher used his known Catholicism as a means to benefit his patron Leicester and the government. And actually it appears that he, like his cousin Poley, acted as a government spy during the Babington plot. In 1601, when a prisoner in the Tower for his part in Essex's rebellion, Christopher asked during his interrogation that the Queen be reminded of his service, and this is a quote, in the discovery of all the Queen of Scots practices, and so clear evidence that he was a government agent. While Christopher's action in relation to Mary, Queen of Scots is interesting, it's not actually even certain that he was then still a Catholic. In a letter written by him to Sir Francis Walsingham on the 3rd of June 1588 from the Netherlands, he referred to his conversion to Protestantism, declaring that, to you my soul was ever known. God hath altered me from my opinion in religion, and I not altered it to please any man, but to save my soul. So Christopher's conversion is quite interesting because it underlines the possibility that individuals may have changed their religion, making it very difficult to make statements about an individual's faith without firm evidence of belief at any one time. It is possible that as a convert, such as Christopher, that we might actually mistake them as for a church papist. We have to be a bit cautious. Christopher did not remain a Protestant, however. He married the Earl of Leicester's widow after his patron's death and joined his stepson, the Earl of Essex, on campaign in Ireland. And actually, he became reconciled to the Catholic faith in Dublin by Robert Lawler, the Catholic Vicar General of the English Pale, and a Jesuit named Fitzsimmons. And he attended confession with them both. Interesting, actually, although Robert Cecil was aware of Christopher's reconciliation as early as October 1599, the information was only used against him in 1601 following his arrest for his leading role in his stepson's rebellion. This supports the view that Christopher, who was protected by his prominent place in Essex's household, as his parents had been in Leicester's household, was able to practice his religion with relative openness until it became clear that it was a threat to the state, suggesting that he was relatively free to change his religion as he chose. Family members, however, rushed to distance themselves from Christopher following his arrest, and his brother Edward Blount of Kidderminster wrote to the Chief Justice of Chester to assure him that he refused to see a servant of his unfortunate brothers, since he was unaware of his intentions. And Christopher's religion was, of course, referred to at his trial. He was asked what Essex had hoped to achieve from the rebellion and whether Christopher thought that he, and this is a quote, would have suffered toleration of religion. And Christopher replied that he thought so, and said he should be to blame to deny it, for the Earl had many times said to him that he liked not the forcing of men's consciences, and in his usual talk would say he misliked that any should be troubled for their conscience. So it was suggested by the court that Christopher's primary motive for taking part in the rebellion was religion. And it was claimed that he told Sir John Davis in Essex that Essex had promised toleration of religion, the Catholic religion. He then allegedly converted Davis to Catholicism after the pair many times had conferences on religion. But actually, Christopher always insisted that his primary motivation had been affection for his stepson. On the scaffold, he declared, "And I beseech you all to bear witness that I die a Catholic." Yet so, as I hope to be saved only by the death and passion of Christ, and by his merits, not ascribing anything to my own works. And I trust you are all good people, and your prayers may profit me. So Christopher's statement, made in anticipation of death, provides a good example of beliefs for English Catholics. He evidently sought to stress the similarity of his beliefs to the faith of the state, because, of course, justification by faith was a doctrine that could be acceptable to Catholics and is a key tenet of Protestantism. At the same time, he also dismissed a belief in the power of good works, but he did require assistance in purgatory. Christopher's statement is therefore suggestive of the elements of Catholic beliefs that could be considered important to an Elizabethan Catholic, who at times conformed to the state's religion. So even at the moment of his death, he's picking out points of similarity. So I'll just take us through a few more Blounts before we wrap up, a few more Blounts, because the Blounts show very clearly that an individual could potentially be known to be Catholic, but not necessarily have that used against him. Christopher's brother, Sir Edward Blount, was a well-known Catholic and at times a recusant. In a letter written to Robert Cecil to outline a dispute in the household of Lord Mountjoy, Francis Mitchell, who had hoped to be appointed as Mountjoy's sole secretary, claimed that Mr. Edward Blount, the Catholic, appointed by his lordship superintendent of his household, made a division of the secretary employments and shared away the two best parts. What's really interesting here is Mitchell has an axe to grind against Edward Blount, but his complaint isn't based upon the ground that Edward was a Catholic. It's instead used as a description, albeit a potentially prejudicial one. Edward's reliance on Lord Mountjoy echoes that of Christopher's earlier relationship with the Earls of Essex and Essex, and again indicating that a position within a Protestant noble household could be enough to secure some level of religious tolerance for Catholics in the Elizabethan period. Edward Blount also demonstrates very clearly that the Catholic community was not necessarily a homogenous one. In 1604, for example, he threatened to report for recusancy a Catholic neighbour who owed him money. Other prominent Blounts, actually, there's Sir Michael Blount of Mapledurham, who actually is a very striking example of a Blount in public office. He is quite well known to be a Catholic. In fact, his house has a number of priest holes in it. And he actually served as Lieutenant of the Tower of London from 1590, an office that had actually been held by his father, and was responsible for the Catholic prisoners. He was actually remembered for carrying letters from Philip Howard to the Queen in an attempt to obtain a meeting for Howard with his wife, for example. And actually on Howard's deathbed, he was observed to weep. Tellingly, Blount is recorded by Henry Garnet as having referred to Robert Southwell as that saint, for example. And he does lose favour in 1595, but he loses favour for conspiring with the Puritan Peter Wentworth to try to arrange for the Seymour succession to the throne rather than the Scottish succession. So it's not his religion that brings him down. But there are also examples of Blounts who do suffer for their faith. We have a distant Blount cousin, Walter Blount of Uttoxeter, who was imprisoned in the Marshalsea on the orders of the Bishop of London on the 28th of July, 1580 for Papistry. And he actually spends more than 20 years in prison for this offence. It was famously remarked that Elizabeth I had no wish to make windows into men's hearts and secret thoughts. Her Act of Uniformity of 1559, which required everyone to attend the parish church on Sundays and on feast days, confirmed this. So church and state were united, something which potentially made disloyalty to Elizabeth treason, so disloyalty to Elizabethan settlement treason. What the example of the Blount family demonstrates most clearly is that it was loyalty, which meant adherence to religious statutes rather than actual belief, which was required for an individual to have a functioning role in Elizabethan society. In the event that a person's religious beliefs brought their loyalty into question, for example, with recusancy, then the individual was in danger of a fine, imprisonment, or even torture and death. Of all the examples of Catholics in the Blount family, Walter Blount of Uttoxeter is the only example of a Catholic entirely unprepared to compromise, and thus the only true example of a Catholic who maintained a lifelong position of recusancy. Walter Blount of Uttoxeter confessed that he hath relieved divers seminaries, priests, and other traitors unto the Queen's Majesty, but saith that he knoweth none at this day. And this is something of an exaggeration, because it's clear that even in prison he remained in contact with Catholics, both at large and in prison. But he had limited means to assist the Catholic cause in England. By taking such an uncompromising stance, Walter in fact made himself somewhat irrelevant. It was his less confrontational kin, such as Sir Francis Lacon of Kinlet, who was able to advance the cause of their religion in England through assisting the Jesuit mission and by maintaining links among the Catholic community. So some level of compromise does seem to have been key for most Catholics, with very few taking a position of outright disobedience. From the evidence of the Blounts, a picture emerges of a family of largely traditional faith who maintained a number of strategies to maintain their faith. The Blounts show the family adapting to the religious climate in which they found themselves by a variety of different strategies, many of which were inside the Protestant parish church itself, something which they were potentially able to shape at a local level, thanks to their local dominance. So identifying a Catholic in Elizabethan England can present a challenge, particularly due to the diversity of thought and responses to pressure they exhibited. The thrust of scholarship over the last 2 decades has been to move away from restricted definitions and to admit a wider variety of people into those who would be considered Catholic. The evidence concerning the Blounts, I think, supports this. Despite their Catholic loyalties, they were very much a part of society, both at a national and a local level, with the communities that they built adding another layer to the existing networks of connections which existed in society. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, that was brilliant. That was a fascinating talk, Elizabeth. I found it really interesting because I'm fascinated by that period of history and these families as well, and what they got up to. And I think it's very much the case. And I've certainly argued that Catholicism was a sort of spectrum and a sort of fluid thing. It was all about kind of loyalties and shifting loyalties, a bit like people change, vote for different parties in elections today, that, 1 minute they're Labour, the next minute the Tory sort of thing, and then they can't make up their mind. And I think a lot of it was like that. There were people who were diehards who just stuck to one thing and never moved. But many others, it was a fluidity, as you said, and compromise. And they, it's like, who's asking the question? What answer shall I give them, sort of thing. And it's kind of they sort of hedged their bets as well, and who was in power and so forth. So it's really interesting. If anybody would like to put questions into the chat box, then that would be excellent. David says, most interesting, lots of interesting facts. Thank you. So I'm not sure whether we've got any more questions at the moment. Somebody's asked, Kevin's asked, is the family still extant? Do they still exist?
Yes, so at Mapledurham, very much so. Most of the other major branches have sort of not exactly died out, but are sort of no longer sort of manorial holders, or their manor houses are gone. The Lacon family's successors to Kinlet, I believe, moved to the Channel Islands. So there are still some left. In fact, there's a covenant on some of the documents, which means you have to correspond with them to be able to view them. But in general, there are a lot of members of the Blount family dotted around, but they tend to be less leaders of their county. I was actually saying earlier to Tim that James Blunt, the singer, is one of my Blounts. In fact, his father actually owns the portrait of Sir George Blount of Kinlet that I mentioned earlier.
Interesting. There's connections then with Mapledurham, and I haven't been to Mapledurham for a long time, but I think I need to visit again and have a look at that.
Yes. So again, not a particularly close relative to some of the other branches, but they're very interwebbed, the family. So although actually often the closest ancestry is quite far back, they do treat each other as kin. So Lord Mountjoy is called upon quite frequently to assist sort of lower ranking members of the family, even though actually quite distantly related to them.
I happen to notice on the family tree of James Blount of Deddington, born 1443. So there must have been Deddington's about 3 miles from where I am.
Yes.
Must have been a connection there, although I don't know what.
The Blounts of Kinlet actually come originally from Deddington, and they owned a very small manor in the parish called Blounts Manor. and they
Right.
then inherit Kinlet through a female ancestor and move there instead, and eventually sell Deddington, I think, in the 1490s. But yes, so the John Blount, who's shown on the slide here, actually would have been one of the Deddington Blounts, except for they sold the manor, but they were never particularly substantial landowners there. And actually, in the manor courts there, it's all fairly sort of they get fined for not ringing their pigs and things like that.
More farmers probably than anything else.
Yes.
I wonder if there's anything in the church at Deddington that anybody can dig up about them at all. It's be worth having a look there, actually. I think it's nearby.
Yeah.
Somebody's asked, are they still Catholic?
Yes. Usually, not all branches, but a substantial number of the surviving branches are still Catholic. They're actually, I mean,
one of the Blounts.
Sorry, what's that?
Sorry. Yeah, one of the Blounts just joined the Facebook group only about 2 days ago, but I can't remember which particular Blount it was.
Yeah, and most are Catholic. Because I obviously get contacted by quite a lot of Blounts, which is always lovely. And most branches are still Catholic. I mean, they were surprisingly homogenous, actually. Most in the Elizabethan period are, as far as I can tell, do remain Catholic. There are a couple of notable converts to Protestantism, but in general, they are Catholic and they remain Catholic.
I found the same thing with a study of another Catholic family nearby who actually owned the land where I live, actually, at one time. But they basically looked for spouses among the other Catholic families. They were all kind of interconnected, as you said, that they'd go up to Lancashire or wherever it happened to be, wherever they found somebody. They were all interrelated, and even some of their servants and people like that, they found them from other Catholic families elsewhere in the country.
Yeah, we can definitely see that with the Blounts. Absolutely. Not just servants as well, and the priests that we know, we can know by descriptions. You can sort of tell whether it's the same priest or not. And actually, they're travelling quite big distances potentially around some of the Catholic gentry households. So again, it's another link where they've got these strong connections.
Yeah, interesting. Any connection with St. Nicholas Owen, I wonder, and Priest Hides, because he certainly travelled around the area.
Yes, he did. I've not come across a connection with them. I think the main problem is, apart from Maple Durham, none of the houses survive that the Blounts occupied. So we can't, I mean, I would assume it's highly likely that Kinlet Hall will have had several priest hides. I would think it's certainly got a number of priests there at various points. The house at Mamble, where the Blounts of Sonington live, you would expect there to also be priest hides, but unfortunately they don't survive. So I've not come across a direct connection, but absolutely he's active in the area and active and involved with people that the Blounts are certainly associated with. So I would think it's quite likely.
But seems very likely, really, because he was so well known and did travel around throughout the Midlands and Lancashire and so on. Let's see what else we've got. David says, interest in the Blount Letters Knowledge and property documents I have for the Coventry area. So I don't know whether that's of any interest.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, the Letty's Knowledge connection is really interesting. Christopher Blount is effectively her toy boy. He was renowned for being very good looking, as all the Blounts were, and she marries him quite soon after Leicester's death. Her son actually calls it his mother's unhappy choice, but is reconciled to it. But no, I'd be very interested in anything that anyone has on Blounts or on Letys Knowledge. So I'm always interested in sort of more. It's been a long running project, and obviously I finished a PhD, but I'm certainly interested in anything anyone has.
Okay. Isabel says, fascinating. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm really interested in the secret printing presses and the possibility of one at Kinlet. How widely were these publications spread, and who were the target audience?
Excellent question. So they were potentially spread quite widely. Again, they're travelling through the Catholic networks. So you would expect the Catholic gentry particularly to own copies. And then they sort of, are able to disseminate the contents to some extent to their servants and tenants on the estate. Because often, actually, what we find, at least what I find with the Blounts, is that there seems to be quite a lot of Catholics sort of lower down the social scale living on their estates. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Reformation didn't necessarily reach Kinlet as much as Henry VIII would have hoped, or Edward VI would have hoped. But yeah, so they do spread quite widely, the books. The authorities are very good at tracking down these networks. So often the information we have comes through government reports. But the networks are quite wide, and they are able to smuggle books in with quite regularity.
The ports are very porous, weren't they? I mean, they were able to get them through various different ports and then travel up through the networks, up through the Midlands, or often from the south, Southampton, for example, up through the Midlands, moving from house to house and so on. And the priests sometimes were, I don't know, other identities and various other things, moving from place to place. And some of them, of course, were classed as servants, inverted commas, but actually weren't at all, really. But anyway, Kevin says, are the descendants of Bessie's son by Henry VIII?
Sadly, no. He dies as a teenager, actually. Like a lot of male members of the Tudor family, he dies when he's 17 in 1536. So no descendants. He might well have become king. Had he lived. I think Henry would have preferred him to his daughters, but it's one of those sort of what ifs of history.
Yes, there's a lot of those, aren't there, really? We've got a question. Did any Blount women enter religious communities?
So this is something I'm trying to track down. I haven't found any that definitely did at this point, but there are a few that I'm trying to follow up leads with. One is a sister of Bessie, actually, Albora Blount, who certainly grows up. She appears in family wills and then sort of just disappears. And with a name like Albora, she shouldn't be that difficult to track down. So I wonder whether she did enter a religious community. The family certainly have links on the continent. Her cousin Christopher, for example, is taught by William Allen, for example, is at Dewey. So it's not at all impossible, but as yet, I haven't been able to track any of them down.
Of course, quite a lot of these recusant families, they did send sons and daughters abroad to become nuns, monks, priests, whatever, brothers, and so on. And that was, for some of these families, was relatively common. It was one of the reasons why some of them died out as well, because too many of them became priests and nuns and so forth. Certainly this family that I've researched anyway was a problem. So is Elizabeth Norton on email, David says?
Yes.
If so, could forward details of the Blount and Knollys document.
That would be wonderful. I've actually put it on the slide here, although it's not in the best of fonts. Now I look at it. It's mail@elizabethnorton.co.uk. I would love to see them, actually. That would be wonderful, if you didn't mind.
Okay. Well, hopefully we can you can facilitate that in some way or other. Excellent. I think there was a good point about this sort of patchy imposition of the recusancy laws on these families, that it varied from time to time and place to place, and who was in power and who annoyed who, sort of thing. But some of the families were able to kind of carry on quite happily, knowing that they were Catholics.
Yeah, I mean, there is notable that there are clearly Catholic members of the family where actually their parish doesn't seem to report any recusants, particularly the Blounts of Campbell, which I think is surprising, particularly when the daughters leave to marry and they then start to be reported as recusants. It does look very much like there's underreporting in that parish. And of course, the church wardens are responsible for making the reports, who have largely been appointed by the Lord of the Manor. So I think it's likely that what is happening in the parish isn't necessarily in full accordance with the law.
No, there's a lot we don't know because it wasn't recorded, because, as you say, the church wardens could be leaned on very heavily not to report things, because it's like, you know who your master is, you know who your landlord is, and so on, and something might happen. So
yes, absolutely.
Don't write anything down.
Yes. And I mean, certainly in more secular aspects of life and the manors, with court records, for example, we can see that the Blounts very much do sort of don't necessarily play fair in the manor courts, if you like. So if people might find it's best to keep on the good side of the lords of the manor, I would say. So I think that would probably extend to religious matters as well.
Well, when they were sort of tenants of this person, it would be foolish to actually annoy them too much and things like that, or employed by them in some ways. But of course, the church wardens were charged with reporting those who attended or didn't attend to church, and hence the various games that these families played with sort of like the head of household going to church and the rest of them staying at home and saying that they were ill or whatever. And of course, the women couldn't be fined, but they could be obviously imprisoned, and many were. But it was like playing cat and mouse with the authorities, I think, at various times with a lot of these families, wasn't it? It was right, I'll go if somebody enforces me, and then I'll stop going, sort of thing, or somebody will go, but I won't go, and it's kind of. But they did sometimes use the church for christenings, marriage, and funerals in order to, for inheritance rights and things like that, and legal documentation. They forced to do that sort of thing. Of course, Catholics weren't meant to be buried in the churches, were they?
No,
but of course they were.
Yeah, they kind of have to be in that. I mean, some of the Blounts, there is a private chapel at Wiley where they quite often seem to get buried, and there's also a chapel at Nosal in Staffordshire, which is in the Blounts' control, and that seems to have a bit of a reputation for non-conformity, and again, is used as a burial place. But in general, it's the point where you have to engage with the parish church to some extent, burial, because you've got to be buried. Baptism, you can sort of get away with saying that the child looked like it would die, and so the midwife baptized them, but burial, you normally do have to engage.
In the case of Somerton, a village near here, where there was a Catholic family, they even had their own little Catholic churchyard or graveyard, apparently. Although the farmer family were buried in the chapel in the church there, but the local Catholics, of which at least half the village were Catholic, apparently, had their own little churchyard, or rather graveyard. Interestingly. I don't know whether we've got any more questions there or not. I can't see any more questions. I don't know whether anybody has any more. I'll check through the chat. I can't see any more questions anyway. So yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much, Elizabeth. That's been absolutely fascinating. Lots of interesting things to think about, and it very much echoes the experience of many other of these Catholic families, actually. And they're a fascinating bunch. The Vaux family pop up as well, don't they? They pop up in this story. And I was talking to somebody recently, actually, who met some of them, actually, and they're still Catholic, apparently. So they're still around. I mean, quite a number of these families are, in fact, actually. So yes, so maybe some of the Blounts will contact us now, actually, and then be interesting to see what they know. Well, I mean,
some do actually still have their own sort of small archives, actually. Some of the families even sort of living in quite ordinary circumstances, not in great halls, which is always really interesting to see what they have.
Yes, you never know what things might turn up from time to time, actually, or what happened to some of these records, because sometimes they're dissipated and went to different people, and then you never know quite when they'll turn up at some time or other. Well, that's really interesting. I think I'll have to visit Maple Durham. I haven't been there for a long time, and I'm going to have a look in Deddington Church as well, and see if I can dig up anything. Not literally dig up, mind you, but you know what I mean. Yes, but very interesting. Well, thanks ever so much.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Excellent, great, and we have more talks. Right, William, we have some more talks, don't we, coming up in the near future? Don't know whether he can.
Yes, the one next month is Victor Slater, the Popish plot that never was.
Yes, the Popish plot that never was. So we'll find out why it never was. So that would be really interesting. So we've actually got speakers lined up until Christmas, I believe, yes. Which is excellent, which is really, really good. We're also thinking of having some site visits as well. That's yet to sort of be confirmed, but we've had a meeting, haven't we, the other day about that. So we're hoping to have at least 1 or 2 site visits during the year to places of interest. So there'll be more about that a little bit later on, but we're working on it. I know a number of people have asked us about that, and we did used to have trips, visits before COVID came along, and put a stop to it. So hopefully we will again soon. So brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I do hope you've enjoyed it. It will be on YouTube, and you can still send us messages or emails or whatever if you have any more questions. I'm sure Elizabeth would answer any if there are any more that you can think of after we finished this evening. So thanks ever so much. Sorry about the coughing, by the way, but not much I can do about it, unfortunately. Right. Well, bye-bye from me, and
Bye.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.